Okay, we have a few questions, one from the live stream and the rest from our other panelists for a group of really rich interventions. The first one is from Rada de Souza to Wazir. She said, you located Rodney's scholarship within the context of struggles of the Guyanese people very well. How do you see present day initiatives by universities in Western countries to incorporate decolonizing curriculum in the university system? In other words, how do you see the attempts to mainstream decolonizing curriculum in the higher education sector today? And if Chantal also wants to come in on this, I think that would be fine.
To be honest, the way I would attempt to answer that is that, I mean, there was never any. I mean, the Europe-centric approach to education has always been the template upon which the universities are organized. There is really no attempt in any place to really decolonize the curriculum. We would know that if we see, for instance, in general education courses, when history is a part of a general education core, that every student who graduates is able to understand African American history. History, I mean, for students to understand African American, they have to take African American history as an elective. So any attempt, any idea of decolonization of the curriculum must include treating the people's history as part of the curriculum, that is the general education core. So long as teaching the people's history is not part of the general education core, any talk about decolonizing the curriculum, all it is talk.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I would like to say a word or two. I've never been impressed by the talk about decolonizing curriculum, or about why isn't my, any lecturer black. I understand the desire to have people like us in universities, but it is odd that decades after formal colonialism ended, that the thrust around this matter focuses on colonialism, as if what is being taught isn't straightforward capitalist ideological rubbish, and as if that is not what has to be fought and defeated. And so it may just be that it's easier to say colonial than to say capitalism, imperialism, but it is capitalism, imperialist ideology that is the enemy of working people everywhere, black and white, Asian and Latin American, in the academy, right? And so I've never really been impressed by the thrust of decolonizing the curriculum, although I think I understand what is being attempted.
I just want to quickly say one thing. The reason why the question of decolonization is important is because where did race come from? Where did racism come from? Remember, it occurred within the construct of Atlantic slavery. It did not happen because of Atlantic slavery. The division, division based on how close one is to whiteness, or how one is to blackness, those ways in which prejudice and the prejudicial structures and cultures got established and becomes part of the sociology of these communities is colonial. And so we have to decolonize the curriculum.
One further little, for me, colonialism is one of the modes of oppression of capitalism, imperialism. Obviously, racism was attached to it and is fundamental to capitalism, imperialism in the last 500 years. The stuff that gets taught in universities is not different, or not much different now to what it was whilst colonialism was in place. But the objective state of affairs isn't anything to do with colonialism. It's certainly to do with racism, but fundamentally it's to do with what capitalism, imperialism, and its agents decide that they want to teach in places like this or in places like the Caribbean. And so I understand why people have said decolonizing the curriculum, because maybe it's easier to say that, but colonialism is no longer the enemy. And if we were going to be strict, and we were talking about Africa or the Caribbean, it would be the neo-colonial curriculum that we'd be having to challenge, and indeed we'd have to challenge that in those places.
Let me just ask a quick question of you, because what you're saying assumes that in the Caribbean we don't have to decolonize the mind.
I repeat that clearly colonialism mattered, and in places like the Caribbean, colonial forms of education are still there. Most of the moves around decolonizing curricula are here, not there. You won't find any decolonizing curriculum movement among students or the populace in the Caribbean. There's a little bit of it in South Africa for the specific reasons that apply there. So the thrust is something that comes from the metropoles. And in the metropoles, I'm saying that while colonialism is part of the history, and the racism of the colonial era and now is part of the history and the now, what we have to tackle is the curriculum that racist imperialism imposes upon us and upon white people for its own, in its own interest.
Very good. Okay, I've got a question. Chantal, you sure you don't want to come in?
Just very briefly to say I agree with Cecil's interventions. I think this is a really intriguing question and discussion. I think it's very much alive in universities amongst, you know, staff as well as students. And even thinking, so I said before, but I think that decolonized institution is near impossible, is impossible. And that doesn't mean that there are individual efforts, especially around decolonizing the curriculum. And I think about, especially as an academic who's new to the UK, even though I grew up here, that's tells you something. But the whole REF system, the research excellence framework, right? You know, who does it serve? Who is refable? What kind of ideas are accepted? And that's what brings the institutional / department funding, who is employed, etc. And also I support efforts by, for example, establishing a free Black university, as well as efforts that people of African heritage have made themselves to educate ourselves, such as the supplementary school system or school.
Different matter.
Yeah, these, yes, but I think this is so important, especially in self-education, right? And training young academics, those who want to be academics, those who enter the school system.
Okay, just to say we do have this space for another hour and a half, so I do want to get to the final comments in about 15 minutes, but if we don't get there and we push things ahead a little bit, that's totally fine, because the conversation's got a life unto itself, and I agree that it's a really vital conversation. This question is from Chantal to everyone. Can any of the speakers say more about places where Rodney's work was and is currently banned? And Wazir came in and kind of gave it a bit more nuance by saying they're not officially banned. The ruling parties use control over the state apparatus to enforce their non-appearance, but it's certainly something that pops up every so often with an op-ed by George Lamming or something, saying there's still no presence. There's still, people don't know who he is in Guyana. Does anybody want to take that?
Let me say briefly that what happens popularly and what happens in universities back to the Caribbean now is kind of different. There's no Rodney and, for example, very little Garvey in any Caribbean school age curriculum. And it would be odd if there was. there is some in the university. At University of the West Indies, Mona, I taught a course on Caribbean revolutions, which included Walter's work, and we actually taught Walter very seriously in the way that we taught Garvey. But that was for, you know, the people who were doing those courses in the Department of Government, and nobody else got it. I don't know, to be honest, what the history department did, but Chantal spent a little time in the history department at the University of the West Indies, and she might remember what they did with Walter. The whole business of how Africa and the Caribbean, in the allegedly decolonizing moment, the moment of independence, restructured curricula, remains an absolutely crucial issue for everybody. Now, as it happens, that moment coincided with the appearance of some very good African scholars who said some important things about the nature of enslavement, about the nature of trading relations between states in West Africa, trading states in West Africa. And so that historical achievement is there, but it didn't represent anything like the basis for the radical reconstituting of the African curriculum. It applies the Caribbean as to continental Africa. So all of that stuff still has to be done. I mentioned, I think before we got on air, that Walter was involved in trying to recast history as a subject to be taught and practiced in East Africa. I've never seen what the curriculum that they produced is. I have one other experience, which is somebody called Dani Nabuderi, who's now dead, and another friend of mine who's also now dead, had a project to develop a Pan-African history course for the whole of Africa. I'm afraid they got no funding. No African government, we're working out of Namibia and Uganda, no government, none of those governments and no other African government was interested, and the Ford Foundation and UNESCO weren't interested. So we've got a long way to go.
Can I jump in here?
Of course.
Let us begin or continue with the clear understanding that the structures that exist to continue the exploitation of the working people,
yes,
and the enrichment of foreign capitalist class, as well as the local hangers-on, the people, Africans and Caribbean people, who we usually call the middle class for the most, who benefit or think they benefit from the crumbs that fall from the tables of imperialism. This is the structure that Rodney fought against, and these are the people who are still in power. And I don't think we should be overtly surprised that they fear Walter Rodney and they fear his work. And many of those people are still trying to assassinate Walter Rodney. Of course, they've assassinated him physically, but they're trying to do it politically, ideologically, scholarly, and so on. And we've got to be aware of the outlines of the battle conditions that we're talking about here. My own experience, and I see Wazir, I think was urging me to do this, to talk about my own, one part of my experience, but I'll talk about two experiences. Some years ago, I was asked to be a consultant to a Caribbean Examinations Council curriculum on, I think it was religion in the Caribbean. And I had to tell people, or that group of people, that religious education is something different from the study of religion. What they wanted to do was religious education, because, as I pointed out to them, there was something about Christianity, and it was the received notion of Christianity, received from the people who did the worst crimes in human history and used or abused Christianity to tie off the minds of African people so they could continue to do their dirty work among us. Judaism, yes, Judaism was going to be studied in the Caribbean. There was something about Islam, and that was it. So I said, what happened to Rastafari, Candomblé, Santiera, Jordanites, all of these so-called African-derived religion? And people fought against it. You know, they fought tooth and nail to make certain that a study of religion in the Caribbean would remain the study of Christianity in its most backward sense, not even asking questions like, where does Christianity come from? Not even getting to the point of saying that a lot of Christianity was developed by Africans in Africa. And these ideas and practices have been looted by white people and turned against the very source of these things as an oppressing religion. So that's one thing I want to offer. The second thing I want to offer is the experience of the Walter Rodney chair. Now, we may argue that the PPP government, not the current one, but the one before, who came up with the idea of the Walter Rodney History Chair at the University of Guyana, was being or may have been opportunistic. And I certainly think that that's a question that needs to be asked because of when it was put forward and the circumstances and so on. I'm not going to argue it's a bad thing. I'm going to say that it's much needed by Guyanese people. And I applied for the chair and I was appointed. And then there was nothing. And then the position was re-advertised and I was appointed to that chair once again. Part of the agreement, as I understand it, is that the Ministry of Education would pay for the operationalizing of that chair while it's the University of Guyana that administers it. Well, the Ministry of Education, under the government that has just been replaced, I'm talking about the APNU government, which contains the PNC as the leading party, did not honor the obligation to pay for that chair. Now, this seems significant to me because perhaps the only logical way of seeking to understand that is as a continuation of the very vulgar attempt to delete the presence of Walter Rodney from Guyana and from conversations and scholarship in Guyana. Let us remember that around the same time, there was a strange happening where, put it mildly, the government as it existed then went behind the backs of the Guyanese public to pull down the name of the National Archives as the Walter Rodney Archives on the very curious pretext that the thing was not gazetted. And, you know, we have this kind of puerile backwardness that represents the policy of a group of people who masquerade in the racial politics of Guyana as representing African Guyanese. I mean, Walter would have had no truckers, but I'm saying that even at the most elementary, perhaps even vulgar level of racial politics, you would have expected that group of people to say, well, yes, you know, we want something to happen here and it's in our interest or in the interest of the people who we serve. No, it didn't happen. And anyway, you turn it or twist it, it is a very, very serious attack on scholarship, on history, on the education of the Guyanese people. And I think that this is one of the ways in which we continue to see both the potency and the danger for people of Walter Rodney scholarship and what he represents.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'd like to make a democratic decision here. We've got a few more questions. Are you happy to go over maybe 15 minutes to take them?
Yes.
We still have.
I would definitely. Sorry.
Okay.
Let me respond. I would definitely go over because I'll have to run away from this gathering, not because I want to, but because of a previous engagement immediately after then, much to my regret, but I'm hoping that I will be of some service in the future.
Appreciate it. We definitely need to keep this going at some level. Okay, the next question was from Kevin, who had to excuse himself. He said, thanks for the mention of Rodney's children's books. I'd just like to briefly ask how readily available they are in Guyana, continuing this theme, and whether they are among those of Rodney's books that are to be featured in school curriculum. Given that they fight against the divide and rule strategies that Cecil is speaking to, how important is it to get it to Guyanese children?
Okay.
Should I have a go for it?
Well,
I could answer.
Yes, Kimani, please.
Okay,
Yes.
I could answer part of that question. I don't know how readily they are available in Guyana right now. I think my brother Wazir might be able to tell us something about that, or at least I'm hoping so. I put my hands on all kinds of things, materials from Guyana, and certainly as soon as those books came out, I tried to get them. I don't have a copy of the one on India, you know, but I got Kofi back in the first edition. I don't think those texts are very readily available. I think they'll have to be reprinted. I think also that they're extremely valuable because they're aimed at children. And we don't need to discuss how significant an invention is when we start teaching children appropriately. The other thing I would say here is this, that I fear that teachers in Guyana will need to be taught how to teach not only Rodney's text, but any text that is consistent with the representation of the interests of the vast majority of the Guyanese people. Conditions in Guyana have deteriorated. There's been, over the years, an exodus of teachers. I think it has improved marginally, in the very least, in recent years. But Guyanese teachers have become known in Africa, in places like Botswana, for example, throughout the Caribbean and in North America, for the excellence of their product. And this is because the training colleges produce teachers, the university produces teachers, and a lot of them migrate to greener pastures. And those pastures are greener because they offer something more than what is offered in Guyana, which doesn't offer very much to its people.
One small point, if I may. My understanding of it is that those two texts started off as 2 of 6 radio talks that Walter did because he was seeking to document for children the main ethnic sections, if you like, of the Guyanese population, and to do so on a progressive basis for children. So the whole set need to be dug out, edited, and organized for republication. They are not readily available anyway.
Yeah, they will have to be published.
Yeah.
And be readily available. But that, I mean, and you know, I agree with Kimani. The teachers will have to be, there will have to be some kind of instruction for teachers and teaching these books. But the other point I want to make is that, I mean, accompanying this recent decision to allow these books to become part of the curriculum should also have been, probably it is in the decision, but I would like to see history of the Guyanese working people, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and all the texts, People's Power, No Dictator, Struggle Goes On, Walter and Arnold Rampersad, and all of these things reprinted and be available for the public to purchase, be available in all libraries, in all school libraries, primary, secondary school, community libraries, the University of Guyana libraries, all across the country.
Yeah.
Then we would know that there is a serious attempt to reform the curriculum, to allow these kinds of discourses to take place. It should also be accompanied by funding for the history department of the University of Guyana and the beefing up of the history department of the University of Guyana. How would a country like Guyana, which is unlike most other Caribbean countries, because it is the only country, along with Trinidad to some extent, that was part of the sugar revolution of the 19th century, when the rest of the Caribbean, when sugar was ending in the Caribbean. Guyana was engaging in the sugar revolution, and Guyana became a monocrop. You see, we tend to forget, and Walter reminds us, we tend to forget that Guyana became a monocrop economy as the Caribbean became diversified. And this is why Walter said that when we rethink history, when we understand history, and we go back into history, we would see that Guyana is different from the Caribbean and more like Brazil and other countries in South America, because economically, we are more connected to South America than to the Caribbean. So the importance of these books are so important, but it cannot happen just like that. If the University of Guyana History Department is not a proper history department, is not functioning, does not have the resources and the staff. So these things cannot happen in a vacuum.
Also, I would urge that we think about contextualizing the information, perhaps updating it in some ways. We shouldn't allow it to escape our attention that the production of knowledge has moved on from where one left it, and that if we're going to properly locate his work, then some of the new things that have been learned, the newer knowledge, will need to become part of that environment in which the work is located. And I would urge properly updated. To understand what I'm hinting at, perhaps I should say that one of the things that scholarship has got to do is to retake knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems that have been destroyed or deleted or partially deleted across the world. And I mentioned ancient Egypt, the study of the Nile Valley, early on, I think before we came on the air. Walter mentions ancient Egypt in his text, but we need a far more explicit understanding of ancient Egypt as part of our carrying forward of Walter's work or any progressive work. And it's not just ancient Egypt in isolation. Ancient Egypt in its proper genetic and organic and sustained contact with the rest of Africa, not in a way that Eurocentric scholarship attempts to disconnect it from living Africa. And these are developments that became far more explicit after the murder of Walter. But we must make certain that his scholarship continues to live and vibrate among us in ways that help to propel our understanding of this world. That's one of the best tributes we could pay to this outstanding scholar.
One more point I want to make, and that is the importance of availability of history of the Guyanese working people cannot be overstated. Because what the history of the Guyanese working people do, it demystifies this history, and it allows East Indians to see that they also participated in the making of Guyana as well as African people. And that, you know, there's this idea that is being floated around that the East Indians who came and were made to work for the wages that the ex-slaves, that the enslaved were paid at the time of apprenticeship, that they saved the sugar industry. And it's a narrative that will be debunked if this history is available for everyone to read.
Thank you very much. Okay, I have a question from our sister, Donna Mattis, who's part of our group as well. She said she's wondering, with the emerging role of China as a power and the symbiosis of state capitalism in China with liberal capitalism in the United States, which has seen China exploiting its labor force by making it available to world capital and decimating the global working class. How can we use Rodney's scholarship to address this and take it from the theoretical to the practical against the background of someone who was passionate about the humanization of the working class?
I'll answer it this way, Amanda. You know, I think it was 2009, I was asked by Interpress Service in Brazil, because of the Brazilian incursion in Latin America and the taking over of the use of Brazilian capital to take over land. You know, this area that is called the Cerrado in Brazil, I mean, we have about maybe 15–20% of the Cerrado left. It has all mostly been taken over for the production of corn and soy, specifically for the Chinese. Now, my response was, look, what I would want from the Chinese is for them to be true to their socialism, to their socialist rhetoric. We should not, you know, they're imperialists, basically, they are imperialists. If they were true to their socialists or socialism, then they would socialize their foreign capital. What I said is, why go into Africa? Why go into Latin America? Why go into these countries and help local capitalists who you're colluding with to take over villages and farms and small people's land? Why not funnel that capital to their same small people in order that they can boost their production, and then you can buy the products from them? But they have no interest in that. So they're not different from what the Europeans did in England in the enclosure movement, or what the imperialism was done across time. And so we have to be clear. We have to be clear. State socialism or state capitalism and liberal, all is the same thing. What's the difference between these things? Why are we splitting hairs on these issues? When the Chinese established schools in China so that it can bring the high school kids who are doing well in Africa and instruct them and then send them back to Africa, what is it the Chinese are doing? And we have to be clear on these issues.
At the risk of seeming to contradict you, my good brother,
go ahead.
I want to put up, I want us to think about something. I'm not really contradicting you. I'm just making something, adding to the complexity of the situation. Because one of the things that the Chinese have done in Africa and elsewhere that Europeans have not done, or done to that extent, is to promote infrastructural development. And I think in our attempts to understand it, we need to include the full complexity of what's happening in China. On the negative side, that's assuming that infrastructural development as articulated by the Chinese in Africa is positive. On the other side, the Chinese have been in places like Ghana, where they're associated with environmental degradation on a very large scale. And I think that when we look at China's participation, intervention, call it what you will, in other parts of the world, especially the developing world or the underdeveloped world, there are some of the issues that come out of the practice. Another one is racism. Chinese racism in Africa is something that has been reported upon, and you would have expected that a country that has the history of China and has the ideology that China proclaims would have been more careful in representing itself and having itself represented in parts of the world where racism has been a scourge, racism by Europeans. But we see these things happening in parts of Africa. And I think that that adds to what you're talking about, Wazir. And on the other hand, the promotion of infrastructural development gives us something to wonder about, to ask ourselves, what is the cost of development? Should development have any negative effects? Is there a different kind of development when we have what the Chinese themselves call win-win? You know, what's happening here? What do we do? What is the way forward? I don't think that, I certainly don't have an answer, but we are seeing, even in what appears at first to be a positive development, we're seeing very, very negative issues, outcomes associated with it also. And for some people, the Chinese are just another set of imperialists. I'm a bit hesitant to accept that without reservations.
Point taken, point taken.
May I make a point or two? Clearly, the easy comparison between China as imperialist and genuine capitalism imperialism is an easy one to make. And I don't say that it's content free, but as an African, when I look at our resources, they're not primarily controlled in Beijing, they're primarily in London and Paris and Washington and so on. That's my first point. The second point is that China had a genuine revolution that broke with international imperialism and has enabled them to make a path of their own. Clearly, they're not perfect, and the point about Chinese racism is a very powerful one. So what I think we need to be careful of, and what I'm certainly being careful about, is recognizing that the core problem might not be China. The core problem is actually neo-colonialism. The neo-colonialist leadership in the Caribbean or in Africa are unable. Walter talks about this in his 1975-76 paper onto the Sixth Pan-African Congress, actually 74 Pan-African Congress. The incompetence, the backwardness, the anti-working people characteristic of our leadership in the so-called Third World, Africa, Caribbean. Let's stick to them. They're the ones who are facilitating and benefiting from all of those negative developments that we want to blame on China. And so what the issue raises is not that we join with the West in their racist anti-Chinese ramp, which they're now doing, right? But that we recognize that what Africa and the Caribbean needs is the revolution that China had, which liberates us from capitalism, imperialism, gives us the kind of leadership that we need, and that enables us to analyze what is happening, enables us to work with rather than against our people, and so on. I'm outraged that there are Africans and others who are joining with Western imperialists and pretending to be interested in the Uyghurs. When was the West interested in any Muslim people? And they're only interested in the Uyghur because they can use them against China. One system, one country, two systems was working very well with Hong Kong. The West encouraged an idiotic generation of young people to do what they did 2 years ago. And now they're talking about China depriving Hong Kong of freedom. It's completely idiotic. And on what basis does America or Britain, with their racist incarceration policies, their racist stop and search, their systematic racism, dare to talk about freedom in China, when, right, what I experience as a Black person living in these places is, you know, the systemic racism of them, and I'm not about to join with them in any campaign against China, right? China must be handled by proper African leadership who understand our interests and can deal with foreign forces and arrive at the correct outcome.
I'm very sorry to have to intervene at this point, because I'm really disturbed. If when I make a criticism, or someone makes a criticism of China for their inhumanity and inhuman treatment of the Uyghurs, that somehow we are joining with Western imperialism. All I'm saying is that the Chinese should be true to their socialism. And if they're true to socialism, then they would be humanists. That's all I'm saying.
No, I don't know that the Chinese are not humanists. I know that there's a problem with the Uyghurs. I do not accept the Western representation of it. And I am completely skeptical of people who destroyed 3 or 4 Muslim countries before our very eyes and are presently destroying Palestine, telling me something about being concerned about Muslim people on the edge of China. It's incomprehensible, it's unacceptable, it's foolish, and I'm not going down that road. Now, I don't say that China is above criticism, but I do say that we are watching a move organized, or the whole of the media, government after government in the West, right, are now in this business of putting themselves on some moral plane above China. On what basis?
We're not joining that moral plane, brother. We're not joining that moral plane. Look, I grew up from my childhood, defending the Palestinians, defending the, giving solidarity to the African liberation movement. Yeah. And it was hard for me to accept when the ANC government shot 44 mine workers in Africa, in South Africa. So we have to be careful that we need to speak on these issues wherever we are, in defense of humanity, wherever they're exploited, whether it is in China, in Palestine, or in any other parts of the world.
It's right.
I think we need to get
one brief moment. Humanism matters, but what matters in the world is class analysis. What matters fundamentally in the world is class analysis. And that is the basis on which I function. So I'm against the ANC government. The moment that murder happened, we've been out on the street in London year after year. In the first year after the Marikana thing, we were out there every week opposing the government. The issue is neo-colonialism and how, if at all, we can manage to get rid of it. Because if we don't, Africa is seriously endangered.
Africa is still seriously endangered.
Yes.
And I didn't have to wait until Marikana happened to realize the nature of the ANC government. I think that when Mandela, for all his fortitude and other good things about him, came out of prison, the kind of reception he received in the Western media should have warned us about what was really happening. I mean, this is a guy who was put in prison because he stood up for freedom. And the same people who claim to represent freedom, praising him to hell and saying that apartheid is finished. But I don't know, perhaps you could help me out, if there's a single blade of grass in Azania that has been handed back to the people from whom it was stolen. Has the apartheid economy been reformed in the favor of the majority of those people who've been exploited for all of these years? Now, if these fundamental issues have not been resolved in favor of the people, how could you talk about the end of apartheid? And how could you say that Mandela, in this second coming, is the kind of freedom fighter and exemplar to humanity that the Western press made him out to be? These are serious questions, and we need to keep remembering what Walter Rodney tells and what he fought for: the people, the people, the people, the great majority of the people. And, you know, in our attempts to understand China, and I take the positions of both Wazir and Brother Cecil on this, you know, it's the African people's interest that we have to keep looking at.
Yeah.
And if the Chinese are allowed to do what they have been doing in Africa, and I do mean those words, I'm not saying that the Chinese are all bad, that all the racism comes from all of them and it represents the government intentions and blah, blah, blah. No, I'm saying that the Chinese, or some Chinese, have been racist in Africa. Whose responsibility is that? Well, you could blame the excuse me, those Chinese, yes, but Africa should have a strong government that is very clear about what the interest, its interest is, and how they're going to represent that interest. And I'm not seeing that in the current situation. And for me, when we look at, if we want to understand questions of Hong Kong and so on, let us first of all remember what Hong Kong is. Hong Kong was taken away from China by military force by the British.
Yeah.
They fought 2 wars to get to sell dope, the right to sell dope to the Chinese.
Yeah.
I mean, Walter taught us about history, about understanding history. So how could a pack of vagabonds who are mass murderers actually tell the people of Hong Kong or the world about democracy, about human rights? These are the people who hung old people, Nyanda, for example, in Zimbabwe, for organizing for freedom. This elder was hung by the British, and it's not a singular occurrence. So we need to be very, very clear that mass murderers, rapists, and other sorts of inhuman people with inhuman practices cannot be our teachers on these issues. They just can't.
One small point on Mandela. I think it's extremely important that we know now, yes, Amanda, we're very brief, that we know that even though Mandela took to armed struggle, he never wanted any more than one man, one vote. We're not in the presence of a revolutionary when you go back and read what he was saying and what he was saying up until the point of his death. Not a revolutionary. He wasn't for any kind of transformation of South Africa, the economy, beyond one person, one vote. And he says so repeatedly.